Jonah Carter always said Bobby Kincaid was the only man who ever truly knew him, right up until the night men hit the floor in Loretta Pruitt's bar. By the time the sirens cut through the neon, folks in Dallas would remember it as a wild gunfight. Back home in the mountains, they gave it another name, one that still hangs on: the night Dallas turned into a killing ground over a jar of clear liquor. Our story starts long after the shooting, in a small Texas prison room that smells like bleach and instant coffee. An old man with rough hands sits across from a camera. He is calm. He is tired. That man is Jonah. He never fired a shot that night. He never held the pistol that dropped 13 men onto sticky bar floors. Yet he is the one who slowly ruined Bobby without touching a trigger. You're watching a tale about loyalty, theft, and pride. Where are you watching from? Stay with me through this case. From that small prison room, the story pulls back to the city that made men like Jonah and Bobby. Dallas in 1984 was hot, loud, and tired around the edges. Big glass towers rose downtown, but out on the south side, the shine had faded. Empty plants and cheap bars ruled the view there. Near the river, an old brick factory sat with its windows punched out. Rust streaked the walls like old blood. Once, the parking lot had been full at dawn. By that year, weeds split the asphalt. A chain-link fence leaned toward the street, more hint than wall. Men still drove by and slowed down out of habit, even though no whistle blew there. Across from that dead plant, a sagging trailer court pressed into the dirt. Gravel popped under tires. Broken toys lay under thin trees. Laundry lines ran from door to door like extra routes. You could step out of one home and hear 3 radios at once. Country from one window, gospel from the next, rock from a cracked car door. Many who lived there had come from the Appalachian hills. Their fathers had cut coal or timber. Their mothers had carried water up steep yards and sung over stoves. Those hills no longer fed them, so they had packed old photos, hand-me-down quilts, and worn Bibles. Then followed rumors of work west. The Dallas they found paid less than they hoped and took more than they expected. Work, when it came, was rough and shaky. Men like Jonah turned wrenches at low-rent garages. Others hung drywall, swept job sites, or laid tar on roofs that baked under the sun. Pink slips could land any week. A bad back or a broken truck might end a job just as fast. Paychecks never stretched quite far enough. Slips stacked in drawers. Kids learned early not to ask for new shoes unless the old pair was falling apart. That kind of pressure pushed people into side trades. Some hauled scrap metal. Some fixed cars in their yards for cash. Some ran pills from one pocket of the city to another. And in the corners where the mountain crowd gathered, clear liquor in jars moved from hand to hand. It was cheaper than most bar bottles. It was also a link back to foggy ridges and narrow hollows where folks had learned to make do in the dark. On the strip where Loretta Pruitt's bar sat, the rules felt closer to the hills than to downtown law. Police cruisers rolled past now and then, but they were thin on that side of town. People understood that if trouble stayed small, it stayed theirs. A man who hit his wife might find cousins at his door. A boy who stole a tool could expect to talk behind a garage. News traveled faster by tongue than by badge. Reputation in that world was as real as cash. Being trusted meant rides to work, tabs at bars, and someone to watch your kids during a night shift. Getting labeled a liar or a cheat could close every door on the strip. Men guarded their names the way they guarded their wallets. Women guarded their children the same way. Into this tight, frayed weave came the old mountain code. You did not talk big if you could not back it. You did not steal from your neighbor. Most of all, you did not take a man's craft, call it your own, and expect to walk that road like nothing had happened. That year, that rule proved stronger than any city law. Long before Dallas taught Jonah about layoffs and liquor tabs, a different ridge shaped him. In eastern Kentucky, the hills folded tight around his family's small clearing. Mist hung low in the mornings, and the sound of a creek worked like a steady clock no one had to wind. That hollow didn't have much in the way of money, but it held something Jonah's grandfather called the real inheritance. Behind the old house, a beaten path led down to a thicket of laurel and scrub. Inside that green cover, hidden from the road, a small copper still squatted beside the water. The pot was patched, the pipe was bent, but everything was cleaned and checked with more care than the dishes in the sink. Jonah learned early that this place was different from the barn or the garden. This space carried his people's name. He watched thick hands break corn, mix mash, and stir with slow, practiced movements. The steps seemed simple: crush, soak, warm, wait. Yet his grandfather treated each part like it held a secret. A slip here, a rush there, and the taste would be wrong. Jonah's job as a boy was small at first. He hauled firewood, kept the flames just right, and listened. While the mash bubbled and the first drops slid into a glass jar, the old man talked about past fights, over land, over fences, over women, and over liquor. Some of those ended with court papers, others ended in back fields with no record but whispers. The lesson was always the same. A man could lose most things and still rise again, but if he let someone rob his name or take the work his people built, he was already dead. Jonah carried those words like a stone in his pocket. When he left for Vietnam, he tucked them deeper. War taught him other hard lessons about noise, fear, and how to keep his hands steady when his heart raced. He came home older than his years, skin tougher, eyes quieter. But that ridge and that still stayed clear in his mind. There were nights in the jungle when he could almost smell the sweet, keening scent of mash instead of rot and smoke. Years later, Dallas replaced the hollow, yet the work did not change. Behind his trailer, Jonah built a small shed from scrap lumber and tin. Inside, a newer still sat on cinder blocks, polished as best he could manage. Neighbors thought it was just a place to tinker, one more cluttered outbuilding in a park full of them. Only a few ever stepped through the door when the copper was warm. Jonah kept notebooks with simple marks rather than full recipes. Dates, yields, who took which jars, who paid on time, who brought new drinkers to the bar. On the wall, a pencil line tracked the height of his two boys growing up, inches marked beside notes about first snowfalls and first busted knuckles. For Jonah, children and craft tied together. One would carry the other. On Fridays, he loaded jars into a crate in the trunk of his battered car. He drove slow to Loretta's place, feeling every change in the road like a doctor reading a pulse. Each jar that left his hands was part of a chain reaching back to that Kentucky hollow. Money mattered, yet meaning mattered more. People did not ask whose recipe it was. They just drank, smiled, and said it tasted right. He knew, and that had to be enough. Over time, Bobby Kincaid slid into that routine like a second shadow. He had easy charm and a way of turning strangers into friends before a song ended. Jonah did not open up much, but he let Bobby help carry crates, stand beside him at Loretta's bar, pass jars down the line. With each favor, that network of trust tightened. Men nodded, debts were noted, and the name Carter gained quiet weight along the strip. Jonah believed the code and the craft, held together by these ties, would guard his legacy. He could not see yet that the same web he wove around his recipe would one day become the tool he used to strike back. For the moment, he only knew that the still was running clean, his boys were growing, and his people's work flowed into Dallas nights in clear glass. By late summer, Jonah's jars were part of the rhythm on the strip. After work, he drove the worn sedan toward town, crate thumping soft in the trunk. Warm air slid in through the cracked window. Neon signs came into view one by one, buzzing pink and blue above the two-lane road. When he turned into Loretta's gravel lot that night, the place felt louder than usual. Trucks jammed the spaces. Laughter rolled out each time the door swung wide. Something had drawn a bigger crowd. Inside, smoke hung low and thick. Music from the jukebox fought with shouted talk. At the far end of the bar, Bobby Kincaid held court on a cracked vinyl stool. His hands moved as he spoke, painting stories in the air. Men leaned toward him, grinning, waiting on the punchline. A pair of women in work shirts laughed, eyes bright, as he tipped an imaginary hat. Jonah slid his crate onto the back counter and watched. Across from Bobby, Loretta wiped glasses with slow, steady motions. Her eyes tracked the room even when her hands did not stop. A small chalkboard sat propped beside the beer taps. Tonight, fresh white letters cut through the grime. Kincaid White, House Special. Under those words rested a single mason jar with a red band around its neck. That band was new. Jonah's jars never wore one. Curious more than scared, he nodded toward it. "What's that?" His voice came out flat. Loretta glanced up, tired smile in place. "That's Bobby's new run," she said. "Been bragging on it all week. Says he cooked it up himself, with Ricky helping. Folks seem to like it." She slid a short glass under the spout of a beer tap for another customer, then reached for the red band jar. "Here, taste. Tell me what you think." The glass she set down held only a finger's width of clear liquor. Jonah lifted it, letting the bar's light catch each tiny bubble. A sour worry pricked his neck, but his hands stayed calm. He brought the drink to his nose. Sweet corn, clean copper, a soft bite at the edge. That first breath matched 100 nights behind his shed. When he let it touch his tongue, there was no doubt left. Heat rolled smooth down his throat, broke sharp, then faded with the exact same hint his grandfather had chased on that Kentucky ridge. His jaw clenched. Inside, something old and solid shifted, like packed earth cracking. Outside, he set the glass down with care. "It's good," he said. The words tasted thick. Bobby spotted him then and lifted his own jar in greeting. "That's the new stuff, Jonah. Dallas is going to know my name after this." Laughter rose around him. A man clapped Bobby's shoulder. Ricky stood nearby, chest puffed, as if he'd built the still himself. Around the room, small signs piled up. Men Jonah had supplied for years now waved their bills toward Bobby. "Pour me some of that Kincaid White," they shouted. Loretta scratched tiny marks beside Bobby's name in her notebook. A short man in a loosened tie sat near the wall, suit jacket folded on his chair, watching each jar that moved. When Bobby drifted his way, they shook hands low and talked with their heads close. From his stool, he took it in like a mechanic studying a stalled engine. Here was more than a friend's side project. This was a new circle forming inside the old one. Bobby had jars with his own name on the chalkboard, his son in the mix, and some stranger from downtown eyeing the trade like a product line. The recipe that once lived only in Jonah's memory now sat naked on a shelf, dressed in a red band and another man's pride. Later that night, as last call neared, Jonah carried his empty crate back toward the door. Bobby's laughter still rolled across the room. Someone slapped a hand-drawn sketch on the bar, a rough idea for a label with Kincaid White lightning curled around a mountain outline. Folks cheered like they were toasting a new baby. Stepping outside into the heavy air, Jonah paused on the crooked step. Streetlight hummed above him. Gravel shifted under his boots. In his head, the old mountain code rose up clear. A man did not steal a name. A man did not take another's craft and pass it as his own. That night, the fight truly began, though no one knew it yet. Outside Loretta's place, Jonah stood on the crooked step a little longer than usual. The night felt heavy. Bugs buzzed around the streetlight, tapping the glass with soft, dull clicks. Laughter and music leaked behind the bar, but it all sounded far away. He walked to his car with his jaw tight, one hand brushing the trunk where his empty crate rode. The drive back to the trailer park took 12 slow minutes. Headlights swept over dark storefronts and the dead factory fence. Inside the car, the wheel felt slick under his palms. He did not turn on the radio. Instead, he replayed every detail. The red band on the jar, the chalk words on Loretta's board, Bobby's bright grin, Ricky's proud shoulders, the man in the loosened tie. By the time the gravel crunched under his tires, the shape of the problem had started to form. Mary Ann's small lamp burned in the trailer window. Inside, the air was close and smelled like fried onions and motor oil. Micah sat at the table in a grease-stained shirt, boots up on a chair, a beer sweating in his hand. He looked up fast when Jonah stepped in. "You're late," Micah said. "Loretta short you?" Jonah shut the door, set his keys down, and lowered himself into the other chair. The vinyl hissed under his weight. "She didn't," Jonah answered. "Bobby did." Those 3 words would later show up in both brothers' statements, almost the same each time. Investigators pieced the rest of this night together from that first flicker and what followed. 2 men at a cheap table, a worn-out wife moving between sink and stove, the sound of a small wall fan rattling above it all. Micah frowned. "What's that mean?" "It means," Jonah said, "he's selling our run as his. Jar on the bar, his name on the board, suit in the corner talking deals with him." He described the taste, the red band, the talk of Kincaid White. Each word landed like a dull hammer, slow but sure. Marianne dried her hands and leaned on the counter. She did not speak, but her eyes stayed fixed on Jonah's face. Money worries had carved faint lines there. School shoes, past due slips, empty pantry days, all of it hung in the space between them. Micah slammed his beer down so hard foam jumped. "We go down there right now, drag him out back, make him say where he got it, knock that grin off his face." Jonah shook his head once. "You throw fists at Loretta's, you'll drag her into it. Cops will show, we'll look like drunks." His voice stayed low, almost calm. Inside, though, anger pushed at his ribs. "Besides, that jar is not the only thing. He's taught Ricky, maybe more. He's talking to some buyer. That means the recipe's walking around in other heads, not just his." He picked up a dull pencil and pulled an old bill toward him. On the back, he marked short lines. Bobby, Ricky, 2 cousins who had spent long nights near the shed. Loretta, the bar crowd, the man in the tie. Jonah knew them all, knew who they drank with, who they owed. The web he'd helped build now looked like a threat instead of a shield. Marianne broke her silence. "Can't you get a lawyer?" she asked. "Some way to prove it's your family's?" "Can't patent what was never written down. Can't call the cops on a man for learning how you stir a pot. They'll laugh us out of the station." He tapped the paper. "Law doesn't see this as ours, but we know it is." Micah leaned forward. "Then we handle it like back home," he said. "Talk with him where folks can hear, make him fix it, or we fix him." Jonah stared at the pencil marks a long moment. In his mind, 2 roads stretched out. One led towards courts, papers, and men in suits who would shrug about stories about hollows and honor. The other led back to the code his grandfather talked about beside the still. A man who stole a name had to face the one he wronged, plain and direct. "I'll talk to him," Jonah said. "Tomorrow night, at Loretta's. Just me and him. No yelling, no guns. He'll hear what he's done, and he'll make it right." That was the choice the record returns to again and again. Not a plan for lawyers, not a report to a regulator. A plan for a quiet talk in a loud bar built on faith that the old code still meant something. He believed that would keep things from getting worse. Instead, it would light the fuse. Next night came fast. Jonah spent the day under a car, hands black with oil, mind somewhere else. Every bolt he turned carried Bobby's voice. Every rattle in the lift sounded like laughter from the bar. By quitting time, his choice felt fixed. He would face Bobby, speak plain, and trust the old code to do the rest. He cleaned up in the garage sink, cold water stinging cracked knuckles, then drove home just long enough to change shirts. Micah watched from the couch, beer in hand, eyes sharp. Jonah told him, again, that this would be talk, not trouble. Micah nodded, but his jaw worked like he was chewing stone. He left before the evening news finished its song. By the time he turned into Loretta's lot, dusk had slid into full dark. Headlights swept across a sea of trucks and cars wedged close. Music thumped through the bar's thin walls. Out here, the air smelled like dust, gasoline, and faint fried food drifting from the vent. Jonah sat a moment, breathing slow, palms flat on the steering wheel. Inside, the scene looked much like the night before, only brighter around Bobby. The chalkboard now showed Kincaid White in bigger letters, underlined twice. More jars with red bands lined the bar. Bobby laughed loud at the center of it, Ricky beside him, a little mirror image. Jonah walked over, told himself this was just a talk between 2 men. "We need to step outside," Jonah said, voice flat. Bobby smiled wide, shook his head, and raised his jar instead. "Ain't nothing to step out about, brother," he answered. "Everyone here knows whose shine this is now." Laughter rippled. A couple of men shifted closer behind him, arms folded, like they were watching a show. Loretta paused mid-pour, eyes tight, but she said nothing. Back in the lot, another car rolled in crooked. Micah climbed out, half a beer already gone, anger carrying him faster than sense. He had told himself he'd just sit at the far end, back his brother if words turned rough. Through the open door he caught Bobby's last line, heard the room laugh, saw Jonah alone near the bar. The push that started it never made the paperwork. Some said Bobby nudged Jonah first. Others swore a drunk at the next stool stumbled. However it began, a hard shoulder hit Jonah's back. He stepped forward into Bobby, their chests bumping. The crowd gasped, then surged. Chairs scraped, a glass broke. Voices rose so fast no single word stood out. Micah saw his brother shove back and moved without thinking. He pushed through bodies, grabbed Bobby's shirt, and swung. The punch landed with a wet crack that sent Bobby reeling into a table. Men lunged in. Someone hit Micah from the side. A bottle slammed against the wall. In that tangle, with fear clawing his throat, Micah's hand found the pistol at his belt. The first shot turned the bar into a tunnel of sound. Muzzle flash lit faces white for a heartbeat, then the room dropped into screaming and running. Men fell over stools, some hit, some just diving for cover. By the time the gun clicked empty, 13 lay on the floor or slumped against tables. Blood spread in dark fans under the neon glow. Jonah never reached for the weapon. He dropped beside the closest man, pressing a rag to a chest wound, ordering a stunned kid to keep pressure there. While he worked, his eyes still logged faces. When sirens neared, he walked into the parking lot and raised both empty hands. Blue and red light washed across Loretta's gravel lot as the cruisers slid in. Gravel spat under tires, radios crackled, and the night that had felt big and noisy a few minutes before shrank down to hard commands and metal clicks. Officers took one look through the open door, saw the bodies on the floor, and called for more help. Inside, paramedics stepped over broken glass and bent chairs. They knelt beside men who had been laughing an hour earlier. Gloves snapped, bandages unrolled. Someone called out, "This one's gone," and Loretta swallowed hard before turning away, hand over her mouth. 2 others still breathed but gurgled. 10 more laid bleeding, shocked or dazed, holding shirts to wounds and staring up at the buzzing neon. Jonah watched them work until an officer led him to the car, hands cuffed in front. On the ride to the station, he sat silent, head turned toward the window. As they passed the hospital, an ambulance with Bobby inside roared past the other way. Both men moved through that Dallas night on separate tracks now, but they were headed toward the same bright building. In the county hospital emergency room, the doors banged open again and again. Gurneys rolled through one after another. Nurses shouted times, injuries, and names when they caught them. Blood streaked the floor in thin lines that mops tried and failed to erase. The waiting room filled as word spread through payphones and neighbors' porches. Plastic chairs creaked under the weight of wives, mothers, and girlfriends. Some clutched purses, some held damp dish towels they had grabbed on the way out the door. A television in the corner showed a game with the sound off, pictures of players running under a banner that no one there could read. All eyes stayed fixed on the swinging doors that led to the treatment bays. Marianne sat near the back with her hands folded so tight her knuckles blanched. She had rushed there without a coat, heart pounding, not knowing if Jonah was on a stretcher or in cuffs. A neighbor had only said, "Something happened at Loretta's. Micah and Jonah were there." When a deputy finally stepped in to call out family names for interviews, she learned her husband was alive, not hurt, and on his way to lockup. Relief came first, then a deep shaking anger that he had been anywhere near those bullets. On the other side of the room, Bobby's wife hunched forward, hair falling over her face. Ricky hovered near her shoulder, shirt sleeves soaked in someone else's blood, eyes wide and glassy. Bobby had gone back under with the sedative. Doctors were inside trying to stop the leak from a hole near his ribs. His cousin stood against the wall, arms folded, watching who stepped up to speak for whom. That was where the first quiet break in Jonah's support showed. Daryl Huff, a wire-thin mechanic who had helped Jonah haul crates and move jars for years, came in late, looked around, and chose a seat close to Bobby's family. He had always split his time between both men, taking side jobs from each. Now, with police already asking about the shooter's brother, Daryl tipped his weight toward the man who still might have a business left when this storm passed. When Bobby's wife lifted her head, He was there to say, "We'll get through this," loud enough for others to hear. Detective Arnold Vega arrived near dawn, tie crooked, eyes ringed red from lack of sleep. He walked the row of chairs slowly, taking stock. Who sat alone? Who clustered? Whose clothes were speckled? His notepad held more than names. It held early hints of lines that divided this small community. Jonah's wife had no one beside her but a neighbor. Bobby's side had a wall of cousins and old bar friends. The picture told him which man had more people ready to speak on his behalf. By sunrise, 2 men from the bar were dead, 3 others clung to life in intensive care, and the rest were stitched, splinted, or sent home with bruises and bandages. In each chart, Micah's bullet was just a piece of metal. In each heart, it was a tear through trust. Jobs would be lost while wounds healed. Medical bills would eat paychecks. Children would learn new words like rehab and trial. Back at the station, Jonah sat in a bare interview room, hands still cuffed, clothes stiff with dried blood that was not his. Through the thin wall, he heard Micah shouting, then the muffled thud of a fist hitting a table. Jonah stared at the scuffed floor and thought about the waiting room he could not see. He pictured who was there. He guessed who had chosen a side. Each guess settled into place like another mark in one of his ledgers. The human cost of that night had only begun to show itself, but the first thing to die was simple, the idea that everybody on the strip would stay neutral. In that bright, humming hospital, the network Jonah once trusted shifted and cracked, one quiet choice at a time. Morning seeped into the station through a narrow window high on the wall. Fluorescent lights still hummed, but a faint strip of gray sat above the holding cell doors. Jonah had not slept. He sat on a metal bench, shoulders tight, eyes on the scuffed floor. Somewhere down the row, Micah snored in short, sharp bursts. Every few minutes he jerked awake, swore under his breath, and dropped back against the wall. An officer came with a jangling ring of keys and a clipboard. "Court time," he said. Chains clicked as he cuffed Jonah's wrists and clipped a short chain to his belt. In the hallway, other men waited in line, all of them in County Orange, all headed to the same building where bond, guilt, and blame would be weighed by strangers. The ride to the courthouse was short. Through the van's wire-covered window, Jonah watched the city roll past. School buses stopped at corners. Women walked small children across crosswalks. For them, it was only another weekday. For him, it felt like stepping onto a track laid years ago on that Kentucky ridge, a line running straight through Loretta's bar and into downtown Marble. At the courthouse, deputies led the group up a broad flight of steps. Reporters already waited, cameras hanging from their necks, pads in hand. They had heard about 13 shot at local bar and come hunting for faces to match the words. When Jonah appeared in the doorway, flashes popped. He flinched more at the light than at the shouts. Inside the arraignment room, everything narrowed. Wooden benches groaned under the weight of families and curious onlookers. On one side sat Mary Ann, hair pulled back, eyes hollow from the long night. Next to her, a neighbor held her hand. No other kin had made the trip. Travel costs, money the Carters did not have. Across the aisle, Bobby's row overflowed. His wife, Ricky, 2 younger boys, and a line of cousins filled the seats. A bar owner Jonah knew from another part of town sat with them. At the end of the row, that same man in the loosened tie from Loretta's bar now wore a full suit. He leaned close to Bobby's wife, whispering, then scribbled on a legal pad. When the judge came in, the room hushed. Charges were read in a flat voice. Attempted murder, aggravated assault, weapons counts. Jonah heard his own name linked to words like aided, encouraged, and failed to leave. Micah's list ran longer and sharper. The prosecutor argued that both brothers were a danger, that the fight at Loretta's showed how fast they could turn a small slight into gunfire. She pointed toward the benches where victims' families sat. Several women wiped their eyes. A mother of one of the dead stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Then Bobby's name came up on a different docket. His charge sheet was lighter for now. Illegal sale of liquor, tax offenses tied to the bar. His lawyer stood to speak of a hard-working businessman who had cooperated with authorities. Cousins nodded. The suited man from the bar supplied a letter from his company vouching for Bobby as a potential partner. The judge set his bond lower than Micah's, higher than Jonah's, but the tilt was clear. From his place at the defense table, Jonah watched the room sort itself. Bobby had cousins, businessmen, and bar owners on his side. Jonah had Mary Ann and a neighbor. Loretta hovered in the back, uneasy. On the ride to jail, he weighed Bobby's reach against the faces of hungry boys at home. Back in the county jail, the ride from court ended with the same clang of gates and the same sour mix of bleach and sweat. Jonah stepped down from the van in shackles, walked the short hall with the others, and kept his face blank. Inside, though, his thoughts moved faster than they had in years. They uncuffed him in the holding tank and handed him a small paper sack with his things: the watch that had stopped working, the thin wallet, folded photos of his boys. He sat on the bench, opened the wallet, and stared at those faces. In the courtroom, Bobby had stood with cousins and businessmen behind him. Jonah had stood with one tired wife and a neighbor. That picture would not leave his mind. Around him, other men cursed the judge and the bond amounts. Jonah half listened. The noise barely reached him. What stuck was the memory of Bobby's row in that room. Every ally was a brace under Bobby's feet. Every bar owner, cousin, and buyer made him taller in front of the law. If those people stepped away, Bobby would drop. When the guard called his name and sent him back to his regular block, Jonah asked for paper and a pencil. The man shrugged and pointed toward a rolling cart near the phones. Later, when most inmates were watching TV, Jonah took a seat at a steel table under flat light, a dull yellow stub of pencil in his hand. On the top of the page, he wrote one word: Bobby. Below it, he listed every name tied to that man: Ricky, 3 cousins, 2 bar owners, Loretta, the suited stranger from the chalkboard nights. Beside each, he scratched short notes in his tight script: who owed money, who feared bad attention from the state, who respected the old mountain code, who only cared about profit. The sheet turned into a rough web. He saw it clear. Bobby's strength wasn't his pistol hand or his charm. It was this web of people who sold his jars, poured his liquor, vouched for him in church and court. The law might not care about a stolen recipe, but it cared about tax fraud, illegal sale, and lies on contracts. If those same people stopped holding him up, or worse, spoke against him, the judge would see a different picture. For a long moment, Jonah thought of his grandfather. The old man would have wanted hard answers behind a barn, fists, maybe worse. But Dallas had just shown what guns did. 13 on the floor, 2 dead, his brother facing decades. That road only widened the graveyard. He could not walk it again. So he chose another way. He would not fake evidence. He would not threaten wives or kids. He would not run. He would use the only thing this city seemed to hear: people speaking on the record. One by one, he would pull at the threads of Bobby's support until there was nothing left under that man's feet. His first letter went to Loretta. He wrote slow, keeping his words plain. He told her where the recipe had come from, how Bobby learned beside him in the shed, how the red band jar tasted exactly like his grandfather's run. He reminded her who had brought jars when business was thin, who had never asked for his name on a sign. He did not ask her to lie. He asked her to tell the truth if anyone came with questions. The second letter went to the state alcohol office. Jonah had once seen the name Hal Sutter on a paper taped up in another bar. Now he wrote it at the top of a lined page. He admitted to making untaxed liquor. He laid out what he knew of Bobby's deal: dates, amounts, the planned Kincaid white label. He said the recipe was stolen and the story on the contract was false. He signed his full name and inmate number at the bottom. When the mail cart rolled by, Jonah slid both envelopes in. The soft clink as they dropped into the slot sounded small, but something inside him eased. He could not stop Micah's sentence or erase the blood at Loretta's. He might not walk free again, yet he had set another kind of wheel turning, one that rolled through bars, homes, and offices instead of alleys. In the weeks ahead, those letters would land on desks and under bar counters. Each person who read them would make a choice: stand with Bobby or step away. Jonah had no gun now, no crate of jars, All he had were names on a page and the quiet belief that if enough of those names turned their backs, Bobby Kincaid's shiny new world would crumble. Loretta Pruitt found Jonah's letter wedged between an electric bill and a beer flyer. The return address stamped in the corner made her pause. County Jail. She almost shoved it into the drawer with unpaid slips, but his careful handwriting stopped her. She carried it to the quiet end of the bar where morning sun picked out every scratch in the wood. Sheets from the night before still lay there. A faint glass ring marked the spot where Bobby had waved that red jar band, talking big about labels and orders. Loretta smoothed the paper and read Jonah's slow, neat lines. He told her where the recipe came from, how Bobby had learned at his shed, how the taste matched his grandfather's run exactly. He didn't beg, he just laid out the story and asked her to tell the truth if anyone came asking. When she finished, she set the page down and stared at the chalkboard. Kincaid White, House Special, still ran in big letters. Suddenly it looked wrong, like somebody had put the wrong name on a family grave. She thought about the nights Jonah had brought jars when business sagged, about the favors he never spoke of. Bobby had helped too, but it wasn't the same. One man had shared, the other had claimed. By lunch, her choice was made. When the first regulars wandered in asking for the house special, she reached for a plain jar with no red band. The chalkboard now read only White Lightning, no last name, no Kincaid. When Bobby's cousin came behind the bar to restock, she told him the red band run was off the shelf. He swore under his breath, but he hauled the crate back to his truck without meeting her eyes. Across town, another bar owner unfolded a copy of Jonah's letter a salesman had passed along, for your information. Rumors were already running that the state was sniffing around, that some investigator named Hal Sutter had been seen on the strip, asking quiet questions about untaxed jars and new labels. That owner had never met Jonah's grandfather, but he knew trouble. 2 days later, his bartender stopped pouring Kincaid White as well. In a low building off the highway, Hal Sutter kept his own stack of papers. Jonah's letter sat beside seizure reports, tax forms, and a photocopy of a draft contract stamped with Kincaid White Lightning. Each sheet alone was small. Together they sketched a man who had tried to step from backdoor trade into public business without taxes, permits, and an honest story. Late that week, Hal drove to a drab warehouse on the edge of an old industrial park. Inside, a forklift beeped between tall rows of boxes. The air smelled like cardboard and spilled grain. A distributor rep met him with forced cheer, sweat already darkening his collar. On a sidewall, 3 full pallets of Kincaid White sat wrapped in plastic, bright labels glowing in the dim light. They walked the aisles while Hal asked simple questions. Who made it? Who owned the name? Where the mash came from? The answers slid around the truth. The rep said partner when he meant supplier. He said family recipe, but couldn't say whose family. When Hal laid Jonah's letter on a crate and pointed at the contract copy, his face went slack. Orders had already slowed, he admitted. 2 bars had backed out, others were thinking it over. By the end of that visit, the pallets still sat there, but the launch date was on hold. The rep wanted time and lawyers. Hal wanted full records. Phones began to ring across Dallas and up into the hills. Distributors called bar owners called Bobby's house. Each call carried the same chill. This thing was getting hot. Folks who had shouted Bobby's name a month earlier now let his number ring. In Jonah's block, news drifted in the way it always did, folded in letters and carried in low talk between bunks. Loretta wrote that she had taken Bobby's jar off her board. Another owner said the label deal was frozen. A cousin reported that Bobby was pacing and cursing at home, raging about cowards and traitors, asking who had poisoned people against him. Jonah read each letter twice, then stacked them in order on his metal shelf. The bodies from Loretta's bar had already been counted in news stories. Now another pattern was forming in the quiet. Empty shelves, canceled orders, and friends easing away. The massacre had started with bullets, but the real wreckage spread through people changing their minds. While Jonah stacked his letters on the metal shelf, other papers piled up across town. In a worn Dallas police bullpen, Detective Arnold Vegas stood in front of a whiteboard streaked with dry erase smears. Taped Polaroids showed Loretta's bar from every angle. Overturned chairs, blood pools, shell casings in little numbered circles. On a second board, he had taped mugshots and driver's license photos. Each one matched a name from the hospital list. victim, witness, friend. At first it looked like a tangle. As he drew thin red lines between them, a shape began to show. Most worked the same strip. Many lived in the same trailer park. More than a few shared one last name, Kincaid. Vegas circled Bobby's photo. Beside it, he wrote in block letters, supplier? Witness statements put Bobby at the middle of the night's drinking. Bottles traced back to him. Several men who took bullets also hauled jars for him on weekends. The detective had seen plenty of bar fights. This one smelled different. It looked less like random rage and more like something snapping inside a closed circle. At a state office across town, Hal Sutter flipped through his own stack. His desk held tax forms, seizure reports, and a draft contract for Kincaid White Lightning. Jonah's letter lay on top, edges already creased from use. Hal had spoken with the distributor. He had walked past those idle pallets. He had watched bar orders dry up. Wherever this brand came from, it wasn't clean. He pulled a fresh pad toward him and wrote 3 names down: Bobby Kincaid, Loretta Pruitt, Jonah Carter. Under Bobby, he listed untaxed product, false origin, label deal. Under Loretta, he put key seller, now backing away. Under Jonah, he wrote self-report, claims recipe theft, admits illegal still. That last note would have sunk most men in Hal's eyes, yet here it pointed outward too. Within a week, Hal carried a thin folder into Vega's bullpen. You're chasing bullets, I'm chasing liquor, we might be chasing the same men. They spread their charts on a table. The overlap jumped out. Names from Hal's tax evasion suspects list matched Vega's wounded and witnesses. Nearly every man shot in Loretta's bar sat also in the state file as part of Bobby's shine chain. Vega tapped Jonah's name. He says the recipe was his family's, he said. He never pulled the trigger, but he walked into that bar to confront Bobby the night before it went bad. Motives there. Hal nodded. Motive, sure, but look at who's losing money now. Bars pull Kincaid. Distributor freezes deal. That all started after his letters. He's not just mad, he's moving people. Back at Loretta's, Vega ran a second interview. This time, she did not keep her answers short. She talked about the chalkboard, the red band jars, Bobby's bragging about finally getting his own label, Ricky's pride, the man in the suit. Then she laid Jonah's letter on the bar between them and said, I took his jars off my board after I read this. Because you felt sorry for him? Vega asked. Because he told the truth, she answered, and because I don't want my place tied to lies when the state comes knocking. Her choice gave Vega more than words. It showed him how far Bobby's standing had slipped. The man who once owned that room now had his name scrubbed off the special. As reports grew, the district attorney's staff pulled the threads together. Their draft case memo painted the massacre as the violent peak of a feud between 2 partners in an illegal trade. Bobby was framed on paper as both victim of Micah's bullets and architect of a fraud that tried to erase Jonah from the story. Jonah came off as the quieter brother who stepped into law's light when he wrote the state. One afternoon, Hal sat across from Jonah in the same interview room where the first questions had flown. This time, the detective's folder held copies of letters, not just crime scene photos. You knew those letters would hurt Bobby. Knew bars would pull his stuff, Vega said. Jonah met his eyes. I knew they'd tell the truth, he replied. What folks do with truth is on them. Walking back to his desk, Vega felt a weight he couldn't quite name. Jonah was no hero. People were still dead. Yet the man had used the very systems Vega served, paper, witnesses, law, to cut the legs out from under Bobby Kincaid. The network that once held Bobby up was now, piece by piece, turning into the hands that would help pull him down.
That change showed first on Sunday, not in a courtroom, but under bright tubes in a plain church fellowship hall. The building sat a few blocks from the trailer park. It was a small brick box with a white door and one crooked steeple, planted in a patch of mowed grass and hard red dirt. Inside, long folding tables held crock pots, foil pans and bowls, fried chicken, beans, pies, store rolls in plastic bags. Coffee makers hissed. Children ran circles between chair legs until a sharp look from a mother slowed them. These families had brought the hills with them to Dallas. Old hymns, mountain talk, and potluck Sundays held them together. Service ended with a prayer that mentioned the ones hurt at the bar, but no names. When amen faded, people moved toward the food and then into small knots. They ate, but the real hunger in the room was for news. Who was hit? Who would walk again? What would happen to Micah, to Jonah, to Bobby? Near the big silver coffee urn, 3 older men stood with paper cups. Their faces were lined by years in mines and plants. One shook his head. "Always said Micah was trouble," he muttered. "You don't pull a gun in a room full of your own." Another answered, "You don't steal a man's recipe either." He tapped the table for each word. Bobby knew better. He grew up under the same kind of code. He broke it first. The third man tried to hold a middle ground. "Both sides wrong," he said. "Men lying, men shooting, all the same to the grave." But even as he spoke, his eyes slid toward Marianne, sitting alone near the wall with a plate she barely touched. At the dessert table, women traded shorter words, but they cut just as deep. One with flower on her dress said, "My boy works with Ricky, says he's still bragging, only now he does it quiet." Another shook her head. "Bragging don't pay doctor bills. My cousin's husband took a bullet. He can't lift his arm. That shine money was never worth this." Someone brought up the letter Loretta had shown her cousin, the lines about the recipe, the shed, the red band jars. If Jonah's telling the truth, then Bobby lied right in our faces, lied to the men at the bar, lied in front of God. A low murmur followed. For many there, breaking the code and breaking the truth before God were almost the same sin. Outside, a group of younger folks leaned against trucks, cigarettes flaring. They talked about who might go back to the bar if it ever opened again, who might leave Dallas for good. One boy, no older than 16, asked, "If the law don't care about a recipe, why did Jonah risk prison over it?" No one had an easy answer. They just stared at the smoke and thought about what they loved enough to fight for. Midway through the meal, the pastor tapped his spoon on a glass and asked for quiet. He reminded them that 2 men were dead, more were hurt, and 3 families were in deep trouble. "There's sin on both sides," he said. "Pride, anger, greed. We pray for truth and mercy. We do not take joy in another man's fall." Heads bowed, yet some eyes stayed open, watching who nodded and who did not. Loretta slipped in late, hair damp from the morning rush at the bar. She took a place near the back with a tiny plate and no appetite. Before long, people drifted to her table. She told the same story she had told Vega: the chalkboard, the red band jars, Bobby's loud talk, Jonah's quiet work. She added one more piece: "I took Bobby's name off my board. I'll tell that in court if they ask." 2 of Bobby's cousins heard her and did not argue. After a long pause, one said, "I ain't lying for him, not under oath." The other stared at his hands. "Me neither," he whispered. Later that week, one of them would answer Hal Sutter's questions with more honesty than Bobby ever expected. Years later, when we spoke to folks from that fellowship hall, they all pointed back to that Sunday. They said it was the day the room tipped. Bobby stopped being one of ours and became the one who brought shame. Jonah did not gain full praise. Many still blamed him for walking into Loretta's that night. Yet his version of the story, the one written in careful jailhouse letters, settled deeper into the group. This is how network knockout looks from inside a community. No big speech, no single vote, just a slow turn of faces away from one man and, little by little, toward another. Late one afternoon, a dusty breeze rolled across Bobby Kincaid's small ranch house at the edge of the city. The place sat on a narrow lot, chain-link fence, patchy grass, 2 rusted lawn chairs on the front porch. For years, trucks had crowded that curb on Friday nights as men came and went with jars and stories. Now the street lay quiet. Down the block, curtains shifted when the first patrol car eased into view. A second cruiser followed, then an unmarked sedan. Engines idled, radios crackled. Kids on bikes slowed, turned, and then, at a sharp word from a mother on a porch, wheeled away. This wasn't the kind of visit anyone wanted their children to watch up close. Detective Arnold Vega stepped out of the sedan with a folded paper in his hand. Beside him, Hal Sutter carried a thick manila folder. They walked up the path together, boots crunching gravel. Overhead, a ceiling fan turned lazily on the porch, stirring hot air that already smelled like fear. Behind the screen door, someone moved. When Bobby's wife opened it, she looked more tired than angry. Her shoulders sagged, and the dish towel in her hand shook a little. Vega asked for Bobby. She didn't stall. She only stepped back and called his name down the hall in a flat voice that carried no surprise. Rumors from the Strip and letters from cousins had prepared her for this knock. Bobby came out wearing work pants and a faded t-shirt with a gas station logo. He had always seemed larger than life at the bar, full of noise and grin. In his doorway, under a low porch roof, he looked smaller. Lines at the corners of his mouth cut deeper. He saw the warrant in Vega's hand, the badge on Hal's belt, and the cruisers at the curb. His eyes flicked past them, searching for friendly faces up or down the street. He did not find many. A cousin who used to park in his yard watched from his own window and did not come out. The bar owner who had once promised to stand up for him stayed at work instead. Loretta, only a few blocks away, wiped down her counter and kept her mouth closed, waiting for the phone call she knew would come. The network that had once wrapped around Bobby now hung in loose threads. Vega read the charges in a steady voice. Tax evasion, illegal manufacture and sale of liquor, fraud tied to the Kincaid White Lightning contract, false statements on official forms. Hal opened the folder just enough for Bobby to see the copies of contracts, bar receipts, and letters that backed every line. Somewhere near the bottom lay Jonah's careful words about the recipe and how it had been sold as someone else's. For a moment, Bobby's jaw worked like he might argue, maybe claim it was all just mountain business, that Dallas law had no say in old family ways. The sight of his wife's face stopped him. She stood with one hand on the doorframe, lips pressed tight, eyes already shining. Behind her, his youngest boy peeked around a leg, taking in the badges and the cuffs. Whatever Bobby might once have believed about being untouchable, that picture stripped it bare. He turned, put his hands behind his back without being asked, and let the metal close around his wrists. As the officers led him down the small walk, neighbors watched from porches, yards, and half-open doors. No one called his name. No one shouted that this was wrong. One woman crossed herself. A man quietly shook his head. The silence said more than any words. Back in the county jail, evening news flickered on a bolted-down television. In the common area, inmates gathered around it, drawn as much by habit as by interest. A reporter's bright smile faded into a serious tone as she spoke about new charges against a man tied to the Dallas bar shooting and an illegal whiskey operation. They showed Bobby's house, the front porch, the walk to the cruiser. They said his name. Jonah watched from a metal bench, arms folded. The camera angle caught Bobby's face just as he glanced up and saw the lens. There was no grin there, only shock and a flash of something like betrayal, as if he had expected the world to keep holding him up. Jonah felt no joy, just a heavy finality. The web he had helped weave around Bobby had been turned, strand by strand, until it pulled the other man toward the same system Jonah already lived inside. Here, at last, the power balance that once leaned Bobby's way shifted hard. The man who had tried to erase Jonah's name from a jar now stood alone, his own name read out over charges and case numbers. Jonah had not lifted a gun. He had moved people. The arrest at that small ranch house was the visible proof that his slow, quiet work had landed.
The news clip of Bobby in handcuffs ran for 2 days. After that, cameras turned to a taller story, the trial. Newspapers called it the Dallas Night Massacre case. Some focused on Micah and the gun. Others chased the whiskey angle. All of them printed the same 3 names again and again: Micah Carter, Jonah Carter, Bobby Dale Kincaid. Months passed between the arrest at the ranch house and the first day in court. Jonah marked time in small ways. He learned the sounds of each guard's walk. He traded books. He waited for letters from Mary Ann and the boys. Outside the walls, lawyers filed motions. Families saved for gas and parking. Witnesses were warned not to talk too much at church or at the bar. On a cold morning, the main district courtroom filled early. Wooden pews creaked as people settled in. Reporters lined the back, notepads ready. A sketch artist lifted her pencil when the 3 men were brought in and seated at separate tables. Micah stared at the floor, jaw set.
Bobby shifted in his chair, scanning the room for any friendly face. Jonah sat very still, hands folded, eyes moving but calm. The state called its first witnesses on the shootings. Paramedics described the scene at Loretta's bar. Survivors spoke about the fight, the flash, the sound of shots. Every time, they pointed to Micah as the one with the gun. A few said Jonah had tried to pull people back and help the wounded. The prosecutor nodded, then reminded the jury that Jonah had walked into a bar that was already tense, knowing his brother's temper. When the whiskey story took center stage, different voices filled the stand. Loretta testified with her notebook in hand. She told the jury how she had sold jars from both men, how Bobby had brought in the red band Kincaid White, how the taste matched Jonah's run, how she took his name off the board after his letter. Her words carried the weight of someone who had seen money from both sides and turned one away. Next came a Kincaid cousin. He wore his only suit and looked like it hurt. Under oath, he admitted Bobby had learned the recipe at Jonah's shed. He said Ricky and others had copied it. He said Bobby had told them to keep quiet about where it came from once the label deal started. The cousin spoke soft but clear. In the benches, a few older women bowed their heads. They knew what it meant, in their world, to admit a kin had broken the code. Hal Sutter took the stand with a stack of documents. He walked the jury through tax forms, seized jars, and the draft contract for Bobby Kincaid White Lightning. He did not speak about honor or family. He talked about unpaid taxes, false statements, and how Jonah's letter had helped him see the full pattern. The law cared about those things. On that ground, Bobby stood alone. The defense tried to paint Jonah as a jealous partner who had stirred his brother up. They played Micah's rage like a card, hoping to spread the blame thin. Jonah's own lawyer did not fight his presence at the bar. Instead, he leaned on the difference between a man who came to talk and a man who drew steel. He pointed again and again to the letters Jonah had written, to the fact that Jonah had admitted his own crimes while also exposing Bobby's larger scheme. In the end, the jury split the line. Micah was found guilty on the most serious counts tied to the shootings. The judge's words were heavy as he read out a long sentence that would carry him through most of his life behind bars. For Jonah, the verdict landed in two parts. On paper, he was guilty of tax evasion, illegal manufacture and sale of liquor, and fraud. In the room, he was marked as a thief of another man's legacy. When the judge spoke of deliberate deception and exploitation of a partner's family craft, heads nodded along the pews. Many who once toasted his name now would not meet his eyes. As guards led the three men away, the courtroom buzzed in low tones. Some felt justice had been done. Others thought no sentence could balance two graves and so many broken lives. One fact, though, was clear even to those who hated Jonah most. Bobby's brand was dead. No bar would hang that name again. The network that had lifted him up had helped push the chair out from under him. Jonah's slow, legal revenge was complete, even as he walked towards his own cell.
The transfer bus that carried Jonah from the county jail to state prison felt less like a ride and more like a closing door. Steel mesh covered the windows, turning bright Texas sky into a gray grid. In his lap, chain links rattled softly with each bump in the road, a sound he would come to know too well. The unit they sent him to sat out past cotton fields and scrub, a low sprawl of concrete and razor wire humming under the sun. New gates clanged behind him, each one adding another layer between Jonah and the Dallas streets where Loretta still poured drinks and people still argued about guilt. Inside, the routine settled fast. Count, chow, work, yard, count again. Days lined up like bottles on a shelf, nearly identical unless you leaned close and studied the small differences. Jonah took a job in the laundry, hauling wet bags, feeding sheets through big rollers, feeling steam rise against his face like mist from back home hollows. Other men talked loud, told stories about robberies, dope, women, and luck gone bad. Jonah mostly listened, eyes on the endless white cloth sliding past. Word got around that he was one of the Dallas Bar brothers,
the quiet one who had helped wreck a whiskey deal without ever firing a gun. He gave them bare facts and no glory, making it clear that nothing about that evening at Loretta's was worth bragging over. When talk turned to liquor recipes, he shut it down completely, saying only that some things needed to stay buried with the men who had already paid. Mary Ann wrote about the boys, their grades, the jobs she picked up cleaning houses, the car that would not quite die. She did not write about local gossip. Ink and paper cost too much for that. A few times a year, an envelope arrived from Loretta, telling him which old names had left the strip, what had finally happened to Bobby's idle pallets at the warehouse. One day, she wrote that the state had auctioned them off cheap, labels stripped, contents poured into anonymous drums, destined for industrial use instead of shot glasses. "Your granddad's taste is safe," she added in a closing line. The guard skimming the letter probably did not understand. Jonah kept that page folded in his Bible, beside a small photograph of the Kentucky ridge where the first still had smoked. After several years, his older son Daniel turned 18 and came through the gate thin from work and worry, but standing straight. In the visitation room, with guards watching and plastic chairs between them, Jonah passed on what his grandfather had once given him, the recipe, step by step, spoken low and slow. He did not write it down. The only full version remained in his head and now in Daniel's. Along with the method, he gave a rule. Family could share among themselves, maybe among trusted friends, but never again would that mash bill sit behind a stranger's name. Years later, when news finally reached the unit that Bobby Kincaid had died in a small rental far from Dallas, Jonah felt no triumph, only a tired sense that the circle had closed around empty hands. His own circle was smaller now. One wife still writing, one son carrying a careful secret, and a line of mountains in his memory that no fence could touch. The courts had taken his free years, yet the thing he had fought for stayed in the only place he ever truly trusted, inside family and out of reach of men like Bobby forever. Mary Ann kept Jonah's letters in a shoebox under her bed. On hard nights, she slid the box out, sat on the edge of the mattress, and read them in order. The paper had yellowed at the edges. The ink had faded a little. His words stayed steady. Talk of the boys, of work in the prison laundry, of small memories from home. Between the lines sat everything he could not fix from behind a fence. Life without him was not a straight line. After the trial, Mary Ann and the boys had to leave the trailer park. Rent climbed, and the old neighbors thinned out. A church friend found them a small duplex farther out, with thin walls and off-street parking. Mary Ann cleaned houses by day, took in mending at night, and stretched every dollar. Jonah's prison pay helped a little, but not much. Daniel, the older son, went from boy to man fast. He took a job at a tire shop after school, hands black with rubber and grease, eyes always a little older than their years. Kids at school whispered, "Killer's kid," or "Massacre boy" under their breath. Once, when a classmate pushed it too far, Daniel swung and bloodied a nose. The principal sent him home for a week. Mary Ann sat him down at the small table and told him they had already lost enough to anger. His younger brother Jesse pulled inward instead. He stopped bringing friends home, stopped talking about dreams. Nights found him on the couch with the TV glowing blue across his face, flipping between ball games and crime shows that sometimes mentioned a famous Dallas bar shooting without names. Mary Ann watched his shoulders hunch and wondered how much of their story he carried like a stone. On the other side of town, the families of the dead walked their own rough roads. Hank Brewer's widow, Carrie, picked up extra shifts at a grocery store, bagging food for people who had never heard her husband's name. Her daughter quit college to help with bills. When she drove past the old strip, she turned her head so she wouldn't see where her father had spent his last night. Years later, she still flinched at loud pops in crowded rooms. One of the wounded men, Lionel Pace, survived but carried a scar that twisted across his shoulder and chest. Before the shooting, he had done roofing. After, he couldn't lift his right arm above his head. Pain medicine turned into a habit. His wife left after too many nights of shouting and hollow promises. Their boys grew up hearing that one bad Friday had broken their father, and two last names, Carter and Kincaid, sat somewhere at the root of it. The Kincaid family did not escape the blast either. After Bobby's conviction, his wife sold off what she could: the jars, the old truck, the tools in the shed. She moved the boys to a smaller town where folks did not already know their story. The name still followed them in bits. When Kincaid landed on a job form or school list, people sometimes asked, "Any kin to that whiskey man in Dallas?" The boys learned to answer in tight voices, or not at all. Ricky carried more than a name. He carried the memory of learning the stolen recipe in Jonah's shed and of standing proud beside his father at Loretta's chalkboard. After the arrest, cousins who once envied him went quiet. Some said plain that Bobby had shamed them all. When Ricky looked in the mirror, he saw a face caught between two stories: the son of a thief and a man who still loved his father. At holiday tables, both families, Carter and Kincaid, sat with empty chairs. Folks swapped small, safe tales about kids' grades and new jobs, then fell into silences that felt heavier than full talk. Someone might mention the mountains, or an old song, or a jar that once made its way around a fire. No one spoke much about that Dallas bar, or the courtroom where their men's names had been read. Jonah's network strike did what he meant it to do. Bobby's brand was dead. No one poured Kincaid White anymore. Yet in living rooms, kitchens, and small rented houses, women counted the cost in rent checks, sore backs, fatherless boys, and long drives to visit men behind glass. The recipe stayed in the Carter line. The scars stayed in every line that had brushed against that clear liquor and that loud, bloody night.
Years rolled over Dallas like hot wind sweeps dust from one block to the next. The city changed its skin, layer by layer, until the old bar strip where Loretta once hung her neon looked almost like a different place. Down on that road, the pawn shop, the used tire place, and Loretta's low, dark bar all came down in the same month. A chain-link fence went up, bright yellow signs warned construction area, and men in hard hats walked the same ground where boots had once crunched gravel outside late-night fights. By the time hammers stopped, sleek glass fronts and brick-trimmed lofts faced the street. Dog walkers and joggers used the sidewalk where squad cars had once parked with lights spinning. City planners pointed to the project as proof of revitalization. In a bright meeting room at City Hall, they slid maps across tables and spoke about property values, tax bases, and activating underused corridors. The old trailer park that had held so many Appalachian families shrank too. Part of it turned into a storage facility and a new gas station. The rest stood a while longer, then emptied as rents crept up and wages did not. Some of the mountain crowd moved farther out, beyond the bus lines, into cheaper parks near the county edge. Others went back east, saying Dallas had taken what it wanted from them and given very little back. A few stayed, scattered across different neighborhoods, carrying stories of Loretta's bar and the massacre like family legends that did not fit the new coffee shops or yoga studios. Institutions shifted in smaller ways. The police department added the Carter case to their training binders under Bar Violence, Multiple Victims. Young officers watched grainy photos in classrooms and heard instructors talk about crowd control, about reading tension before it breaks, about how quickly one weapon can ruin a room. Officially, the lesson was about tactics. Unofficially, older cops sometimes added, "Remember, these aren't just numbers. Every bullet hits a web of people." At the state alcohol office, files on Kincaid White Lightning gathered dust in a gray cabinet. New staff came in, read brief summaries, and used the case as a warning for agents. Follow paper trails. Watch for sudden family recipes that move from sheds to labels overnight. The law still did not protect unwritten heritage, but it had learned to spot some kinds of fraud faster. A different part of the liquor world bloomed.
By the early 2000s, Texas craft distilleries popped up with polished tours and tasting rooms. Articles in glossy magazines praised small-batch white whiskey and heritage corn spirits. Their marketing spoke about pioneers, cowboys, and wide skies. No one mentioned a draft contract that once sat in a dusty warehouse with Bobby Kincaid's name on it. The official story rolled on without him, neat and picture-ready. In that bright new scene, the quiet win Jonah had carved out still held. No bottle on any store shelf bore the Kincaid brand. No bar listed Kincaid White on a chalkboard. When older bartenders from the strip years walked into those shiny places, some of them thought of Jonah's letters and Loretta's choice. They knew a few men in prison had helped bury a label long before it could rise. Back in Kentucky, the hills changed more slowly. Coal towns sank, pill bottles replaced mason jars on kitchen tables, and another kind of plague crept through hollows. Yet on one small ridge, a family still met for Sunday dinners, still sang old songs, and sometimes, on very private nights, passed a plain jar between them that tasted like the past. The recipe Jonah guarded lived there, out of reach of lawyers and deals. From a high view, the systems that had pushed Jonah and Bobby into that Dallas strip did not vanish. Work stayed fragile. Poor folks still leaned on side hustles. Law still cared more about taxes and paperwork than about the theft of a story or a name. Jonah's network strike had wounded one man's climb and saved one recipe from a shelf. It had not rebuilt the net under families who came after. Still, when people who remembered drove past the new lofts and cafes, some felt a tightness in their chests. They could see past polished brick to a night of sirens, to a bar where mountain talk filled the air, to jars that carried more than liquor. The city might have painted fresh lines on that street, but under the concrete, the old story remained, waiting for anyone who cared enough to dig.
Looking back from now, the Dallas Night Massacre sits at a strange crossroads. On one side lies the story the law puts in its files. A gun in a crowded bar, men bleeding on cheap tile, families left with graves and hospital bills. On another side lies a quieter story that never fit well on a form. A stolen recipe, a broken code, and a man who chose slow, legal ruin for his enemy instead of a second round of gunfire. Courts do not weigh honor. Statutes do not protect a taste passed from a ridge in Kentucky to a shed behind a Dallas trailer. To the system, Jonah was an accessory to a shooting and an unlicensed distiller. Bobby was a tax cheat and a fraud. Those labels are not wrong, but they leave out why any of it mattered enough for men to risk prison and death over clear liquid in a glass jar. In the world Jonah came from, legacy was not a word from a will. It was the one thing poor families could hand down that no bank could seize. A song, a story, a way to lay a fire, or a recipe that turned corn and time into something strong. When Bobby took that and stamped his own name on it, he was not just grabbing profit. In that mountain frame, he was trying to erase the Carters from their own work. The law had no clean tool for that kind of theft. There was no patent, no written contract from the hollow. Lawyers would have shrugged. Police would have said it was just business. Faced with that gap, Jonah stepped into the only space he thought he had left. First, he misjudged and walked into a bar where anger and alcohol turned talk into gunfire. After the bodies fell, he searched for a path that did not end in more graves. His answer was network knockout. He used letters and truth instead of bullets and lies. He did not forge papers. He did not threaten wives or harm children. He simply told people what Bobby had done and let fear, shame, and tired consciences do the rest. Bars pulled their orders. A distributor froze the deal. Cousins refused to lie under oath. Step by step, Bobby's climb collapsed, not from a single blow, but from many small hands letting go. Was that justice? For the families who lost husbands and fathers on Loretta's floor, Jonah's careful revenge did not bring anyone home. The graves stayed filled. The boys still grew up visiting prisons and carrying names that made doors harder to open. For them, the line between mountain code and just more harm can blur. Yet for those who put deep weight on heritage, there is a dark sense that at least one thing held steady.
The recipe did not leave the bloodline in a stranger's brand. The story pulls us into a hard truth about places like Jonah's Dallas Strip. When systems ignore what people value most, folks fall back on older rules. Those rules can be wise about loyalty and care, but they can also be brutal. Jonah is not a hero. Bobby is not a simple villain. Both were shaped by poverty, pride, and a country that made their kind of work both illegal and, at times, the only way to keep food on a table. If there is a lesson here, it may sit in the way networks behaved. The same web that once helped men share rides, watch kids, and spread jars became the tool that destroyed a brand and locked 3 men in cells. Community can shield, or it can punish, often using the very same ties. When formal justice feels thin, those ties harden into weapons. The Carter and Kincaid story asks whether any of us can truly win when that happens, or if every victory just writes another chapter of loss under a new name. On a clear fall day, long after the last headline faded, a camera followed a narrow road up a Kentucky ridge. The blacktop turned to gravel, then to packed dirt. Trees leaned close on both sides, leaves already edged with gold. At the top, a small cemetery opened to the sky, ringed by an old wire fence and a few sagging posts. The stones there were simple, no statues, no grand words, just names, dates, and sometimes a short line cut deep by a careful hand. Near the back, under a crooked cedar, stood 2 markers that tied this quiet hill to that loud Dallas night. One read, Jonah Lee Carter, with years that began before Vietnam and ended inside prison walls. The other, a few yards away, said Bobby Dale Kincaid, brought home to this ground by kin who could not forget him, even after the shame. Between those stones, someone had set a mason jar. It held clear liquid that caught the light like glass itself. There was no label, no red band, no name at all. The lid was tight. No one had come here to drink. This was not a toast. It was a sign. We don't know who first left that jar. Maybe it was Daniel, grown gray at the temples now, who sat across from his father in a prison visiting room and learned the recipe in a low voice. Maybe it was a younger cousin who heard the story as a warning and wanted to mark the place where it all began and ended. What matters is that the jar sits there, silent, holding both pride and sorrow in one small shape. Far away in Dallas, cars roll past a row of clean storefronts and rented lofts. People sip coffee on patios and walk dogs under neat trees. They pass the spot where Loretta's bar once stood and never feel the echo of gunshots or the weight of men carried out on stretchers. There is no plaque on that sidewalk. The Strip has other stories now. Most days, the massacre lives only in the memories of a shrinking circle and in folders on cold shelves. Mary Ann is an old woman in a modest house, her hands slower but still steady. She keeps Jonah's letters in that same shoebox, now with a rubber band around it. Sometimes she takes one out to read to a grandchild who asks where the family came from and why their name matters. She chooses her words with care, telling enough truth to honor the past, leaving out just enough detail to keep new hearts from hardening. Ricky Kincaid moved twice, then chose to drop his last name in daily use. He fixes cars in another state and tells coworkers his people are from the hills. Some nights, alone in his small kitchen, he pours a little store-bought whiskey into a glass and stares at it, thinking of a shed, a chalkboard, and a contract that never quite came to life. The recipe itself stays where Jonah wanted it, inside family lines, shared only in whispers and small rooms. It is both gift and burden, a reminder that some inheritances cost more than they seem. As we close this story, I want to turn back to you. You've walked through a bar fight that turned into a legend, watched a man use letters and truth to pull down the friend who stole from him, and seen how both law and old codes left deep scars on every family they touched. So here's the hard question for you and for me. If someone tried to take the one thing your people left you, a craft, a song, a name, how far would you go to guard it? Where does protection end and plain vengeance begin? If this story stirs something in your own past, I'd like to hear it. Tell us where you're watching from and what legacy in your world feels worth fighting for. And if you want to sit with more true stories like this about code, blood, and the quiet cost of pride, you can subscribe and stay with this channel. Some tales are hard, but they're ours, and they deserve to be told.